30 years of a man's life can be measured in the calluses on his palms, and the way he can identify a failing motor just by the frequency of its hum. Austin gave 3 decades to that factory floor, arriving every morning before the sun touched the horizon and staying late whenever a midnight breakdown demanded his steady hands. Loyalty wasn't a choice he made, it was the very marrow of his bones, a quiet pact he assumed was mutual until the moment the world fractured. The end didn't come with a handshake or a gold watch, but with a thin slip of pink paper that felt heavier than any steel beam he'd ever moved. Security escorted him to the edge of the parking lot as if he were a stranger. The December wind whipped across the open asphalt, biting through his jacket while he clutched a single cardboard box that held the fragments of a career. Inside sat a stained coffee mug from 1994, a few curled photos of the night shift crew, and a heavy brass pocket watch that once belonged to the manager who had hired him. As the cold seeped into his joints, his mind began to race through the math of survival, calculating the weight of a mortgage and the rising cost of heat against a bank account that was no longer growing. His savings were a ticking clock, with maybe 2 months of life left. 3 months of searching had turned into a slow, grinding erosion of his spirit. He had methodically applied to 63 different companies, and while the phone rang frequently in those first few weeks, the spark of hope always died in the sterile air of an interview room. Austin would press his one good shirt, drive out to those sprawling suburban office parks, and sit across from hiring managers who looked at his resume before their eyes drifted to the silver at his temples. He learned to recognize the exact second the door closed, usually right when they noticed the deep lines etched around his eyes, or the way his hands looked compared to theirs. His skin was rough and stained by years of industrial grease, a physical map of a world these people didn't understand, and they always chose someone with softer palms. No one ever gave him a reason, they just offered a polite nod and moved his folder to the bottom of the stack. 3 months of searching had turned into a slow, grinding erosion of his spirit. He had methodically applied to 63 different companies, and while the phone rang frequently in those first few weeks, the spark of hope always died in the sterile air of an interview room. In one of those rooms, Austin sat across from a hiring manager who looked at his resume before their eyes drifted to his hands. His skin was rough and stained by years of industrial grease, a physical map of a world she didn't understand. Then she looked at her own hands, soft and unblemished, and something shifted behind her eyes. The door closed, and he was moved to the bottom of the stack without a single word. The silence of his apartment became a physical weight that was far harder to carry than the sting of a direct rejection. Without a clock to punch, or the rhythmic grinding of machinery to fill his ears, the days began to bleed into one another until time lost all its shape. He spent his mornings at the kitchen table over a cup of lukewarm coffee, scrolling through endless job boards where every listing felt like a personal insult. The descriptions all used different words to say the same thing, whispering that they wanted someone younger and cheaper, someone who hadn't already given their best years to a ghost. His bank balance suffered a dozen small hemorrhages every week as the rent, the lights, and the water bill drained what little he had left. Groceries became a grim exercise in subtraction, leading him to walk past the meat aisle and the name-brand cereals until his pantry was nothing but bags of rice and stacks of generic canned beans. Without a clock to punch or the rhythmic grinding of machinery to fill his ears, the days began to bleed into one another until time lost all its shape. His bank balance suffered a dozen small hemorrhages every week as the rent, the lights, and the water bill drained what little he had left. Groceries became a grim exercise in subtraction, leading him to walk past the meat aisle and the name-brand cereals until his pantry was nothing but bags of rice and stacks of generic canned beans. 3 months of searching had turned into a slow, grinding erosion of his spirit. He had methodically applied to 63 different companies, and while the phone rang frequently in those first few weeks, the spark of hope always died in the sterile air of an interview room. Austin would press his one good shirt, drive out to those sprawling suburban office parks, and sit across from hiring managers who looked at his resume before their eyes drifted to the silver at his temples. He learned to recognize the exact second the door closed, usually right when they noticed the deep lines etched around his eyes or the way his hands looked compared to theirs. His skin was rough and stained by years of industrial grease, a physical map of a world these people didn't understand, and they always chose someone with softer palms. No one ever gave him a reason. They just offered a polite nod and moved his folder to the bottom of the stack. The silence of his apartment became a physical weight that was far harder to carry than the sting of a direct rejection. Without a clock to punch or the rhythmic grinding of machinery to fill his ears, the days began to bleed into one another until time lost all its shape. He spent his mornings at the kitchen table over a cup of lukewarm coffee, scrolling through endless job boards where every listing felt like a personal insult. The descriptions all used different words to say the same thing, whispering that they wanted someone younger and cheaper, someone who hadn't already given their best years to a ghost. His bank balance suffered a dozen small hemorrhages every week as the rent, the lights, and the water bill drained what little he had left. Groceries became a grim exercise in subtraction, leading him to walk past the meat aisle and the name-brand cereals until his pantry was nothing but bags of rice and stacks of generic canned beans. On a Tuesday night, while staring at a balance that had finally slipped under the $5,000 mark, Austin found himself staring at a cluttered industrial salvage website. He couldn't have explained why he was looking at a digital graveyard of rusted pipes and nameless iron parts, but desperation has a way of making the irrational feel like a lifeline. The site was a mess of blurry photos and broken links, showcasing piles of scrap metal that most people would pay a hauling crew to take to the dump. That was when he saw the tank, a massive cylinder of steel 12 feet wide, covered in streaks of orange rust that looked like dried blood against the grey metal. The description said it had been pulled from a factory that shuttered its doors back in 1987, meaning it had spent over 2 decades rotting in the corner of a scrapyard. The price was listed at $50. $50 was a fraction of a car payment, yet it felt like a fortune and a pittance all at once. Austin stared at the image for an hour, knowing full well that the tank was a useless hunk of corrosion that no sane person would ever want to buy. You couldn't patch metal that far gone, and there was no market for a hollowed-out relic of a dead era, but the price was low enough that it wouldn't break him. It wasn't hope that drove his finger toward the mouse. It was a meaner, sharper feeling born of having nothing left to lose and needing to touch something real. He didn't have a plan for the steel, but he had a desperate need to own something that the world hadn't discarded yet. 21 days later, a flatbed truck groaned up the gravel drive of his cousin's rural property, which was the only place that would allow him to store such a massive eyesore. As the winch hissed and the heavy steel cylinder slid down the ramps, settling into the dirt with a bone-shaking thud, Austin felt a sudden, sickening knot tighten in his chest. Looking at the dented, decaying mass of iron sitting in the weeds, he realized with terrifying clarity that he had just thrown away his last bit of pride on a pile of junk. The tank sat on the property like a rusted monument to every bad decision he'd ever made. It was 12 feet across, scarred by dents he couldn't explain and covered in a skin of decaying orange scale. His cousin had handed over the deed to these 2 acres of nothing, a patch of land choked by overgrown trees and the kind of heavy silence that only settles in places far from anywhere that matters. During that first week, he did nothing but stare at the hulking shape, running his palms over the corrosion until his skin was stained with a fine, bitter dust. This was the only future he had left, and he had purchased it for $50. But then the silence of the woods began to change him. For the first time in months, he was standing on something that belonged entirely to him, and the realization felt like a sudden intake of breath. This space wasn't rented or borrowed, and it didn't depend on the shifting mercy of a landlord or a boss who could decide his value on a whim. The tank couldn't fire him or move on to someone younger, and that simple promise of permanent shelter was enough to make him finally reach for the angle grinder. He had borrowed the tool from a local man who owed his cousin a favor, and the first time the blade bit into the steel, the scream of metal on metal shattered the quiet of the forest. That high-pitched wail was the loudest thing Austin had heard since the day his factory shuttered its doors, and the sound felt sharp and necessary, like a pulse returning to a numb limb. He wasn't just cutting a hole in a tank, he was carving out a door to a world he could actually control. The smell of the work hit him next, a thick cloud of burning rust and hot, ionized metal that clung to his clothes and tangled in his hair for days. He didn't try to wash it off, because it smelled like effort. And for a man who had been idle for too long, the scent of labor was better than any cologne. Inside, the tank was a hollow, echoing chamber that seemed to swallow the beam of his flashlight as soon as he stepped through the opening. It was as cold as a tomb and choked with decades of wet sediment, but as he kicked at the walls, he realized the structure was still incredibly sound. The metal hadn't rusted through the core, which meant it could still hold, and more importantly, it could still protect him from the world outside. That realization gave him a reason to move, and for the next 6 months, his life narrowed down to the rhythmic labor of transformation. He woke up on a salvaged cot every morning to scrape at the walls, eventually lining the curved interior with fiberglass insulation and sheets of plastic that he sealed tight with heavy tape. A small wood stove followed, which he had pulled from a demolition site, along with enough scrap piping to fashion a crude chimney that vented through the roof. He cut a single window from a sheet of clear plastic, and when the winter light finally spilled across the floor, the tank stopped being a piece of junk and became a home. It wasn't comfortable, especially when the January temperatures plummeted and the air inside turned brittle and sharp. He spent those nights wrapped in a cocoon of heavy blankets and 2 jackets, shivering as he watched his breath mist in the air. But it was his. He cooked simple meals of beans over the wood stove and read by the flickering glow of a battery lamp, finding a strange peace in a world so small that the chaos of his old life couldn't find him. Somewhere during those long, quiet months, he stopped checking his phone for emails and gave up on the imaginary conversations he used to have with hiring managers. He had drifted past the point of hope and crashed into a deeper state of pure survival, where the only thing that mattered was the next day. His entire existence had been reduced to a single, desperate calculation of how long he could keep this small world running before the money ran out. By February, his savings had finally hit 0, leaving him to stretch his remaining bags of rice and cans of beans as thin as possible while the winter dragged on. The arithmetic of his life was becoming terrifyingly simple, and he knew he was only one bad storm away from a disaster he couldn't fix. Then, on a morning in March when the ground was still hard with frost, Austin uncovered the thing that changed the trajectory of his life forever. He was hunched over the floor, lost in the mindless, rhythmic work of clearing away the last of the sediment that had settled at the bottom of the tank. His scraper was nothing more than a chipped paint tool, but he moved it with a steady focus, trying to peel back the layers of grime to keep the floor from rotting out from under him. The sound of the metal blade against the steel was a steady, meditative rasp that filled the small space. Scrape. Pause. Scrape again. Then the blade hit something that didn't ring like steel. The vibration that travelled up his arm was dull and solid, and Austin went perfectly still as he stared at the dark patch of dirt. He knelt in the dust, brushing away the grey flakes with his bare palms until a corner of something hard began to emerge from the floor. It was a box, no more than 6 inches across, made of a heavy steel that had been chewed by corrosion but remained stubbornly intact. His fingers were trembling with a sudden, unexplainable shot of adrenaline as he pried the heavy object from its resting place. The weight of the box surprised him, and he carried it out into the pale March sunlight to sit on a slab of broken concrete. The lid was fused shut by decades of rust, forcing him to work a screwdriver around the seam with a slow, agonizing patience until the metal finally groaned and popped open. Inside, he found a stack of old photographs. They were the kind of pictures that had faded into that specific, warm yellow hue of the 1970s, showing a group of men standing proudly in front of the tank when it was still brand new. Back then, the metal was gleaming and industrial, a vital part of a working landscape rather than a forgotten relic in the woods. The faces were clear enough that Austin could see their smiles, and he noticed one man resting a hand on the side of the tank with the kind of affection you'd show an old friend. Tucked beneath the photos was a ledger with pages so brittle they felt like dried leaves between his fingers. He held the book up to the light, squinting at the brown, faded ink that meandered across the lines in a cramped, hurried handwriting. Most of the entries were a blur of illegible dates, but 2 specific words had been scrawled into the margins and underlined so many times they practically jumped off the page. Rare earth. The phrase was repeated like a mantra, appearing in the notes and the ledger lines over and over again until the words lost their meaning. At the very bottom of the box, Austin found one final photograph with a message scrawled on the back in a heavy, desperate hand. His vision blurred as he read the 4 short words. Proof. Keep safe. DM 1978. His heart began to hammer against his ribs, and for the first time since he had lost his job, he felt a sensation that was sharper and more dangerous than simple hope. Austin sat on his cot, clutching the ledger as the pieces of a 40-year-old puzzle began to lock into place in his mind. The box hadn't been lost, and it hadn't been left behind by a careless worker who forgot his lunch. It had been buried here on purpose. This tank was never just salvage. It was a vault for a secret that a powerful company had tried to drown in the dirt 4 decades ago. His hands were still shaking as he set the box down, but it wasn't because of the cold or the hunger that had been gnawing at him for weeks. It was the weight of the truth, and as he looked around the curved walls of his home, the air inside the tank suddenly felt heavy with the ghost of a crime he was finally beginning to understand. The ledger became a ghost that haunted him, and Austin spent the next 3 days obsessing over every square inch of that tank's curved metal skin. He ran his calloused hands across the walls, searching for a seam or a joint where the structure might break, but the metal felt like one solid, uncaring piece. In the old photographs, the men standing before this tank didn't look proud of their work, and their faces held a heavy secrecy that suggested they were guarding a truth they weren't allowed to tell. On the second day of his search, he finally found the flaw. A horizontal seam ran across the lower wall, about 3 feet from the floor, and the line was so deliberate and precise, but it couldn't have been an accident. Austin traced the ridge with his finger, feeling the rough weld where 2 plates had been fused together decades ago, and the metal around it was discolored from the heat of a torch that had long since gone cold. Someone had sealed this compartment shut 40 years ago, and they had gone to incredible lengths to make sure the world forgot it ever existed. Austin borrowed the angle grinder again, but this time he wasn't carving out a door for his own survival, because he was cutting into a secret that had been buried before he was born. The metal screamed under the blade, and the sound was sharper and more violent than the first time he had cut into the hull. Sparks erupted in the darkness like dying stars, and the suffocating smell of burning steel filled the interior until Austin could taste the electricity on his tongue. He worked with a tight jaw and a steady hand, ignoring the way the grinder vibrated through his bones. And when his cousin came out to check on the noise, Austin just waved him off and kept cutting. The job took 3 grueling hours to finish. By the time the metal gave way, his shoulders burned with a deep ache, and his hands were covered in blisters that stung in the humid air. The atmosphere inside the tank was thick with a fine grey dust that coated his lungs, and every breath he took tasted like rust and old machinery. The compartment was small, maybe 3 feet wide and 2 feet deep, and it had been built directly into the wall as a hidden cavity before being welded shut. Austin jammed a crowbar into the gap and pried the metal back, and the old welds cracked with a sound like breaking bones echoing in the hollow space. Inside the darkness sat 6 plastic containers. They were heavy and sealed tight with thick industrial tape, so Austin pulled the first one out into the light with a sense of dread. Even in the dim glow of his flashlight, he could see a metallic powder that glinted like silver sand, and the material shifted inside the jug with a dense weight that felt far too heavy for its size. Austin set the container on the floor and opened the ledger one more time. The frantic handwriting finally made sense, and the words like extraction and contingency were no longer abstract ideas, but a direct map of what had happened inside this steel tomb. The company had pulled something valuable from the earth, processed it in secret, and then hidden the evidence away for 40 years to wait in the dark. He found a few old newspaper clippings tucked into the back of the book, and the paper had aged to the color of rotted teeth over the decades. The first article from 1979 mentioned environmental violations at the factory, while the second from 1980 detailed a quiet settlement with the EPA where the company admitted to no wrongdoing. The math finally added up in his head. The company had been pulling rare minerals from the ground without any permits, and in the process, they had poisoned the soil and the water for everyone nearby. When the government finally came knocking, the corporation paid a small fine and walked away, but they had hidden the physical proof of their crimes inside a scrap tank they thought would be melted down and forgotten. Austin held one of the jugs up to the window, and the silver powder caught the afternoon sun and threw it back at him in a blinding flash. His own reflection stared back from the plastic, looking tired and distorted, and he realized he wasn't just looking at salvage anymore. This wasn't garbage that a foreman had forgotten to toss out. The company had deliberately entombed this material and walked away, fully expecting that 40 years of silence would bury their sins forever. And now, Austin was the one holding the weight of it. The fear hit him then, sharp and cold, and it made his breath catch in his throat as he looked at the stacks of plastic jugs. If a massive corporation had gone to this much trouble to hide the evidence of a crime, he wondered what they would do to a man who had accidentally dug it up. He was just a guy with empty pockets and a broken-down tank, while they were a titan with an army of lawyers, and the balance of power felt so lopsided it was almost laughable. Austin looked at the 6 containers sitting in the dust. They were heavy with something incredibly valuable, but they were also heavy with a danger he wasn't sure he could handle. He had no idea how to handle proof of a crime that was older than he was, and he didn't know if telling the truth even mattered in a world that had moved on. But as he sat there in the silence, he knew that his life had just changed forever. Austin knew he couldn't carry this secret alone. The containers sat in the corner of his tank like unexploded bombs, and while he could read the words in the ledger, he was a factory worker who didn't speak the language of science. He could see the silver powder and feel its weight, but the true meaning of what he had found remained just out of his reach. He spent a night searching the State University website until he found the name of a geology professor named Dr. Mia Stone. She had spent her career writing about mineral extraction and the messes companies left behind. And even though her academic papers were dense, Austin could tell she was someone who cared about the truth. He called the university on a Tuesday morning, keeping his voice low and rehearsed so he wouldn't sound like a crazy person. He didn't give her his real name, but he told her he had found some industrial samples while clearing out an old property, and he hoped she might be willing to take a look. Dr. Stone was skeptical, but she eventually agreed to meet him that Friday. Austin drove to the campus with 2 of the containers tucked into a plain grocery bag, and his hands sweated so much against the steering wheel that he had to keep wiping them on his jeans. He had wrapped the samples in old newspapers to keep them from clinking together, and every time he hit a pothole, he glanced at the passenger seat to make sure his future hadn't spilled out onto the floor mats. The science building was a maze of sterile hallways, and her lab on the 4th floor was smaller and more cluttered than he had imagined. Shelves were packed with jagged rock samples and glass jars of minerals, all labeled with a precision that made Austin feel out of place in his work boots. Dr. Stone was in her shoulders went square, and her breathing slowed down as she held the sample up to the fluorescent lights, and her eyes widened behind her reading glasses. "This is rare earth," she whispered, almost to herself. "It looks like neodymium or dysprosium, and maybe even some terbium mixed in." She turned to look at Austin with a look of sudden realization, and she told him that he was holding a massive fortune in his hands. She spent the next 3 hours running tests, while Austin sat in a hard plastic chair and watched the clock on the wall. She moved between machines he didn't recognize, making quiet notes and double-checking the digital readouts, while the only sound in the room was the low hum of the ventilation system. When she finally finished, she sat down across from him and took a long, slow breath. "If the rest of what you have is as pure as these samples," she said, "you aren't just looking at a few bucks, because this stuff is worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. This is material that the government considers strategically valuable, and it almost never shows up on the open market in this form." Austin felt his chest tighten until it was hard to breathe. "How much are we really talking about?" "It depends on the market and the purity, but it's enough money to change a person's life," she said, removing her glasses to rub her tired eyes. She leaned forward and asked him one more time, with more intensity this time, where he had actually found the powder. So he told her everything. He talked about the scrap tank and the hidden compartment, and he explained the ledger and the old newspaper clippings that proved a crime had been committed 40 years ago. Dr. Chen didn't interrupt him once, and when he finally stopped talking, she sat in silence for a long time while she processed the weight of the story. "This was a burial," she said quietly. "Someone went to a lot of trouble to make sure this stayed hidden, and they probably thought the secret would die with the factory." She leaned back in her chair and warned him that he was stepping into a legal minefield involving corporate liability and environmental law. She admitted that most of the crimes had probably passed the statute of limitations, which meant the company was likely protected by the passage of time. "So it doesn't matter?" Austin asked, feeling the hope drain out of him. "It matters," she countered, "because even if they can't go to jail, the discovery itself is leverage, and a story like this has a way of taking on a life of its own." Austin drove back to his tank that night, feeling a different kind of weight than the one he had carried that morning. The professor had confirmed his wildest suspicions, and he knew now that he wasn't just holding a bag of silver dust. He was holding a piece of the truth, and he was starting to realize that the truth could be the most dangerous thing a man could own. Austin didn't bother walking through the front doors of the company. He knew how they handled threats, the lawyers, the PR firms, the machine designed to manufacture silence. A journalist was a different breed entirely. He found her name on a regional newspaper's website. Rebecca Torres had a history of chasing industrial crimes and environmental rot. Austin called her on a Wednesday morning, and they met at a diner halfway between the city and his property. He laid the ledger, photographs, and 2 containers on the laminate table, like a row of accusations. "This is real," Rebecca whispered. 40 years of secrets, Austin replied, all tucked away in a tank they thought was scrap metal. The story hit the front page 8 days later. It detailed a decades-old environmental cover-up at the shuttered factory, backed by Rebecca's relentless fact-checking of EPA settlements and old violations. Austin's name was right there in the middle. The company's response was predictable. Flat denials from the PR department, legal threats from a firm with a name made of cold initials. But the fire was already moving too fast for them to stomp out. Local news picked up the trail, followed by state networks, followed by national outlets, telling the story of the man living in a salvaged water tank. Environmental groups demanded investigations. State regulators cracked open dusty files from the 1980s. The EPA sent a team to the factory site. The company's stock price began to slide as shareholders asked questions that didn't have easy answers. That's when the lawyers stopped sending threats and started making offers. The first settlement arrived on a Thursday afternoon with a number that made Austin's hands shake. There was a non-disclosure agreement attached. Silence in exchange for the check. He turned it down. They sent a new offer, double the first, then triple. Each pile of money came with the same demand: his erasure, his compliance, a wall built around the story. Austin saw the game. They weren't trying to help him. They were trying to buy his voice and lock it away forever. He could have taken the money, traded the tank for a real house, a normal life, warmth. But for 30 years, that company had bled him dry of time and labor before tossing him aside when his hair turned grey. They didn't get to pay him into silence now. He wanted them to stand in the light and admit what they had done. He wanted a public record that no one could ever bury again. The company was backed into a corner with nowhere left to run. The federal investigators arrived in April, wearing dark suits against the rusted iron and oil-stained earth. The tank was no longer just a home. It was evidence. The hidden compartment became Exhibit A. The old ledger was tucked into an evidence folder, its 40-year-old secrets finally becoming part of an official record. Austin gave his testimony in a sterile conference room at the state EPA office. The company's lawyers sat across from him with faces like stone. He spoke about the hidden compartment, the handwritten notes, the 3 months of silence that had led him to buy a piece of junk. The investigators didn't miss a word. He was the living proof of their negligence. The company finally settled the matter in June. They never actually admitted they were guilty. Instead, they paid massive fines and agreed to fund a multi-million-dollar cleanup project at the old factory site. They released a carefully worded statement about historical practices failing to meet current standards. The minerals were seized and sold at an auction in July. The state sent Austin a check for $200,000. He didn't move out of the tank. Instead, he fixed it. He poured a solid concrete foundation and packed the walls with high-grade insulation. He replaced the old wood stove with a high-efficiency model and mounted solar panels on the roof. He cut real windows into the steel, replacing the plastic sheeting with glass that let the light pour in. The same companies that wouldn't look at his resume 6 months ago were suddenly desperate to hire him. Austin turned every single one of them down. He decided to build something of his own instead. He started a consulting business out of the tank, helping other workers who had been chewed up and spit out by the corporate machine. He taught them how to document violations, how to protect their rights, how to make sure their voices actually mattered. The tank had once been a monument to the lowest point of his life. Now, it was a place where other people came to start rebuilding theirs. The tank still sits on that patch of rural land, a rusted shell that feels more like a home than a grave. The company never offered a real apology, but Austin found something harder to define, a quiet proof that when loyalty is shattered, it can be forged into a different kind of power. Those minerals are long gone now, turned into the energy that powers someone else's world. But the echo of his struggle remains in the air. Every person he pulls out of the wreckage of their own lives carries that same spark forward. He doesn't just vanish into the grey, he transforms into something unbreakable. Stay with us as we uncover the justice hidden in the dust.